Okay, to summarise our journey so far, Epicurus' argument that a good God can never let a corrupted world keep spinning is clearly beginning to fall apart now. We've already seen that apart from anything, we mostly enjoy life on this earth in spite of the difficulties, so we already kind of agree with God that he was right to keep it spinning, to give us our chance at this, and we know that there was enough good left over after the fall to make this world worth persisting with. We've seen that struggle actually makes life interesting. It's the source of our adventures and our stories. Struggle makes life glorious. It's only because of this darkness that we can see the stars. Struggle refines our character, and lack of struggle even spoils our character. These are all reasonable explanations as to why a good God wouldn't pull down the curtain immediately. God is capable of working all things together for good, remember, and we've seen through these episodes that God is even capable of using evil against itself for his own good purposes. Now, throughout these episodes, we've frequently been touching on the idea that this world is merely a wilderness before a promised land to come, that all this is happening now with the pain and the struggle because there's a land of perfection up ahead that God needs to prepare us for. Now, if we accept that premise as the Bible requires, then it actually opens up another reason why God may be allowing us to experience pain and struggle here, specifically so that the peace of that future promised land might be preserved. Now, I'll say up front that this episode isn't the strongest argument, and I'll get into why I say that as we proceed, but it is still a theory, and since we're going to be thorough in this series, it is still worth considering. So let's do it. For God to have created this universe, we know that he first had to have pre-existed outside of this universe. That's biblical, and it's also just logical too. It's like how J.R. Tolkien had to exist outside of Middle-earth in order to create Middle-earth, or how George Lucas had to exist outside of the Star Wars universe in order to create the Star Wars universe. Creators of worlds cannot themselves be a result of that world. Therefore, we know that there is another realm outside of our universe where God resides, which the Bible calls the heavens. There's some quite interesting science on this actually, which I've gone into in Answer Season 2. If you'd like more information on this premise, I recommend watching those videos. Unfortunately, the key episode was taken down by YouTube on copyright grounds, but you can still download that series at this link. Essentially though, all we need to know is that our universe is a realm within a much larger realm. Now, the Bible doesn't go into much detail about that realm outside of our universe, but it does hint at some events that took place there long ago, before the creation of the earth. There was a civilization there of sorts we can gather, but not a human one. The beings there are what we would now call angels, and as far as we know, life in that pre-existing realm was perfect until one of the inhabitants, a particularly beautiful angel called Lucifer, began a civil war. In his pride, Lucifer began to imagine that if he rebelled against God's authority, he could be God's equal and he could establish a kingdom of his own. The more he thought about this idea, the more he liked it, and therefore he began trying to convince the other angels to join him in a great rebellion, a great insurrection against God. Now, Lucifer's propaganda campaign appeared to work to some extent, and he managed to convince around 1/3 of the angels in heaven to join his army for the civil war. We know that God's army then won the battle, and Lucifer was cast out along with all of his cohorts. There is some debate about these verses, and it's not entirely clear because it was written in poetic language, but this is a very widely held interpretation of what happened before the creation of the world in that other realm. There was a civil war, and Lucifer was cast out of heaven with 1/3 of the angels who followed him. And if this interpretation is correct, I've sometimes wondered why those angels followed Lucifer in his insurrection, and I can only really think it would just be down to one thing: ignorance. In other words, it seems that because the angels had been living in perfection in heaven, they didn't know from personal experience what life outside of God's kingdom would really be like. They didn't know what the results of such a rebellion would be. It seems to me that if they had known that it was going to be this unmitigated, self-destroying disaster for them, they would never have gone along with Lucifer. They'd have said, "Don't be an idiot, Lucifer. You know what life outside of God's kingdom would be like. It would be a complete disaster. We're not going along with you. No chance." It was their ignorance that was their weakness here, it seems. They simply didn't know what life outside of God's kingdom was like because they never personally seen it. They never experienced it. And it was that ignorance that Lucifer could then manipulate. Now, after Lucifer and his army were defeated and cast out of heaven, he became known by a different name. Satan, and the angels that were cast out along with him became known as fallen angels. Some say they became known as demons, but again, there is some debate about that interpretation as well. But regardless, the next thing that we know is that God began creating our universe and our world, and this is where we entered the story back in Genesis 1. God is found in Genesis 1 creating our world, filling it with life and populating it with a new kind of creature made in his own image called human beings. Now, this world, when it's first created, is perfect, as we have seen, just as the civilization before us in the other realm was presumably once perfect. And yet, by Genesis 3, Satan is found lurking around this world, seemingly determined to corrupt it just as he'd corrupted the one that came before. And he achieves his aim, and he achieves his aim in exactly the same way too. He goes to the first human beings and he starts whispering to them that God is withholding things from them. He says that if they rebel against his authority, they can be God's equal and they can establish their own kingdom. It's the same lie that caused a third of the angels to fall in heaven, and it works here on earth with the human beings for apparently the exact same reason too. They're ignorant. The humans are naive. All they know is perfection. They have no concept of what life outside of God's kingdom would actually be like. They don't know whether Satan is telling them the truth or not. Mankind is as ignorant as the angels were about what a life apart from God would actually look like. And it's their ignorance that makes Satan's claims seem plausible. So mankind falls just like the angels fell. Now fast forward again until this present moment, and once more we are hearing rumours of God building a new earth, a new creation. Jesus has told us, I'm going to prepare a place for you. When everything is ready, I will come and get you. Jesus has told us this new creation is going to be perfect. Indeed, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. But the question that we have to ask here is, if it's not too impertinent, is what will stop that world from becoming corrupted too? After all, the realm of the angels was once perfect, but it became corrupted. This world was once perfect, but it became corrupted. So what's to stop that new earth from starting perfect, but then becoming corrupted too? What's to stop someone from starting a whispering campaign like Lucifer did in those days? What's to stop there being another rebellion when we get to eternity? Well, if I'm correct that ignorance was indeed the weak point in both of those previous falls, and if that's what Satan was able to prey upon and manipulate, then it seems like the peace of that future world could be safeguarded by removing that ignorance. In other words, letting people experience the fullness of a sinful world so that they essentially learn the hard way, and so that in a sense they become beyond temptation. I said this was the weaker argument at the beginning of this video, and that's because the Bible tells us that we ourselves will be a brand new creation in that world with a brand new character like Jesus himself. And so we will just have no desire for sin or evil in eternity. We will be transformed and be made perfect and have new desires and a love of righteousness. But all that being said, let's just go along with this idea for a moment just to be thorough. Let's face it. If an instigator did try to start a propaganda campaign on that new earth and called Jesus a tyrant and let's rebel against him, it seems clear that having experienced this fallen universe, we will at that point be beyond temptation and we couldn't ever be manipulated. We'll be able to look back at millennia of world history and Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and say, don't be an idiot. Didn't you learn? Remember the lying, the thefts, the murders, the rapes, the genocides, the dictators, the diseases. We already know what life away from God is like, and it's hell. And don't you ever question Jesus' character. Don't you remember how Jesus literally sacrificed himself on the cross to rescue us because he loves us that much? We know Jesus personally. We know his character. We can't be manipulated. It seems to me that if we're allowed to see and experience the full depths of depravity to which our hearts will actually go without God, we will never be tempted to come this way ever again. If this theory has any legitimacy to it at all, that we have to learn the hard way, that we must see and experience the wilderness in order to appreciate the promised land up ahead, then it seems to me that God would need to be very thorough about this. All permutations of a godless world would have to be allowed in the course of human history, and very importantly, be allowed to fail. God would need to allow us to experience a society with education and without education, with technology and without technology, led by men, led by women, capitalist societies and communist societies, societies based on every kind of spirituality and no spirituality, democracies, dictatorships and monarchies. Everything would have to be tried in the course of human history, and that way nobody on the new earth will be able to say, but the only reason that things failed before was because we didn't try such and such. Everything would have been tried, including such and such, so that people finally understand that without God, we are simply hopeless. The key to our happiness, the key to our peace, is God Himself. T.S. Eliot said, "The world is trying the experiment of attempting to form a civilized but non-Christian mentality. The experiment will fail, but we must be very patient in awaiting its collapse, meanwhile redeeming the time so that the faith may be preserved through the dark ages before us to renew and rebuild civilization and to save the world from suicide." What if God has to let us try this experiment that Eliot is talking about here, so that we see for ourselves and are not left in any doubt about our need for God? C.S. Lewis said that this is the key to understanding history. In fact, he said, "What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set up on their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empire, slavery, the long terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. The reason why it can never succeed is this: God made us, invented us as a man invents an engine. A car is made to run on gasoline and it would not run properly on anything else. Now God designed the human machine to run on Himself. He Himself is the fuel our spirits were designed to burn, or the food our spirits were designed to feed on. There is no other. That is why it is just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from Himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing. That is the key to history. Terrific energy is expended, civilizations are built up, excellent institutions devised, but each time something goes wrong, some fatal flaw always brings the selfish and cruel people to the top, and it all slides back into misery and ruin. In fact, the machine conks, seems to start up all right and it runs a few yards, and then it breaks down. They are trying to run it on the wrong juice. That is what Satan has done to us humans. Maybe that's the lesson that we need to learn the hard way through our experience in this wilderness here on earth, that there is no peace and happiness outside of God. What if all of world history is a kind of evidence gathering exercise of what happens in a world where people reject God? What if God is saying, okay, I will let you learn the hard way. I will let you experience the fullness of your own rebellion. I will let you see the depths of depravity to which your hearts will go without me, so that in the process, the evidence will simply stack up day by day, year by year, century by century, how desperately in need of God our hearts really are. What if from the vantage point of the new earth, God's chosen people, as well as being perfected into the image of Jesus Christ, will be able to look back on all of this, the millennia of wars, thefts, lies, and genocides. And what if that means that we will never be ignorant of that stuff ever again? What if, having experienced the tragedies of this world personally, no human being will ever question again how desperately in need of Jesus we really are? It's a theory. I wouldn't hang my hat on this episode, as I said earlier. In fact, there's something about this episode that's not sitting right with me for some reason, but I can't put my finger on what it is that's actually niggling me. But I thought the concept was still worth talking about nevertheless. Actually, if you see a hole in this concept or a theological problem why this can't possibly be true, then send me an email, because I'd be interested in discussing this and thinking more about this one actually. But either way, we must be on to the next one.